Liz, if you had a terror squad, this is a good one. If you had a terrorist, let's say you have a fascist terror group in 1973 in Italy, what are you calling it?
I don't know what Lady Joker is in Italian, but something like that.
La feminine comedienne.
Yeah. Or maybe there's like a Pagliacci, like, is there like a way to make
Black Pagliacci?
Yeah. Dark Pagliacci. That's my new Tumblr aesthetic. Dark Pagliacci.
I'm the crazy.
Like dark clown, but it's not.
Dark clown's been done, Liz.
No. But no. I'm talking more of like the Italian or artistic, a kind of,
so like a Goya
commedia
clown?
dell'arte, dark commedia dell'arte.
I don't know I don't know what dell'arte means, but I know a dark clown when I assume. So Liz, if you was the 1970s in Rome, you and a bunch of guys in Slipknot uniforms would be going around blowing up school children?
Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Come in. Jeffrey Epstein.
Liz, welcome. Wait, that's too Coindexter. Liz, welcome to my toy shop. It's so nice of you to come in here on Christmas Eve. Are you going to say hello to me? No?
Who are you?
I'm Nazi Pinocchio. And I love the Jews.
Oh my God.
Oh.
Nazi Pinocchio. That is the true fascist Nazi alliance.
May I inquire to your racial ancestry, madame?
No,
Franchak, what kind of name is that?
No comment.
Oh, well,
I like Nazi Pinocchio.
Well, Nazi Pinocchio loves the Poles like you. Hello, my name is Brace. Nazi Pinocchio. I put Nazi Pinocchio back in the. That's a tough character.
Yeah, I don't like him.
Nazi Pinocchio. I'm running out of.
Scary.
I ran out of runway there.
Yeah, I'm Liz.
My name is again Brace. I don't know. What if I did that from now? I just did it bookended every time you introduce yourself.
No, you do that though.
I just only did that once. That's why it's notable that we're joined by producer Young Chomsky, and I am Brace. The podcast is called TrueAnon. My name is Brace. Hello.
And that's Brace.
Yeah.
We're back. More NATO.
Mm-hmm. More Nazi Pinocchio.
Well, in more ways than one. We spent the first episode, which, by the way, if you haven't listened to that, go back.
Yeah, you need to listen to that to get this one anyways.
Rewind. Mm-hmm. Stop listening. Don't make the sound.
No, I'm doing it.
Yeah, go back, listen to that, because you need the historical context here. We talk about in the first episode the situation in Western Europe after the war and the American implementation, all those things of the kind of mass Fordist production model, basically reconfiguring European class structure post World War II. Now, here's the fun secret. If you are a listener, what?
Well, I was wanting to hear what the fun secret is.
Oh, if you're a listener of TrueAnon, you would know this, or a reader of, let's say, Marxist material. That kind of reorganization and capitalist restructuring and capitalist class structuring in general requires mass violence in order to fulfill its requirements. And that's what we're here to talk about today, because NATO is more than just a defensive alliance as people think. It is really a kind of I mean, looking at what the kind of terror that NATO backed, aligned, and architected terrorist groups unleashed in Western and Central Europe in the 20th century. I mean, I don't know what else to say other than it's like the fucking like mafia wing of American capitalism. And there's so many to choose from. of the
Well,
mafia wings.
My thing with this, I'm like, listen, if you teach some guys to blow some shit up, they're gonna blow some shit up. And that worked out perfectly for NATO. I think what we're getting into today is sort of a case study about really NATO's only operation prior to 9/11. And I think I want to really hammer home here, as I've seen a lot of people say that NATO is a defensive organization. Obviously, the history of NATO in the 21st century very much disproves that. But I would say that the history of NATO in the 20th century, unless you are using the most liberal ass fucking definition of defensive, meaning kill anybody who lives in your home country that it disagrees with you, the NATO has never been a defensive organization. And in fact, NATO sucks dick and balls.
Yeah. So welcome to part 2. Let's go.
So nice of both of you to join me here at my Italian villa. Oh, don't worry, you can leave the door open. The Pope will be here soon. Not the one that we're going to shoot. This is before that.
That's the Pope that's in charge of the checkbook.
Yes, yeah. No, we're having the cool Pope join us. He smokes weed. It is a pleasure to see you both here today. I have long known you since our time together in the fascist party of the 1930s. And now here it is the late 1960s. And the Vietnam War is in full swing and student protesters are on the street. So it's nice of you guys to join me here so that we can plan an operation where we kill 300 of them with some kind of time bomb. We have, of course, Liz, the Black Countess, and joining us, well, I'm trying to think of what else is like scary and fascist sounding. Crazy Ben Howard, an independent researcher and former frogman, and of course me, Mr. Spies a Lot, which is an Italian surname. And we're here to talk about NATO Part 2, Gladio. Welcome, Ben.
It's a pleasure to be here as always.
Probably my most strained intro to date.
I know, and given the subject matter, I thought you would have had a kind of, I don't know, something else
I'm
up your
little Pinocchio. I was just a little doll made by
Wait,
my master.
can you do a Belgian accent? Chris?
No, sorry. Can I do an accent of something that doesn't exist? What is a Belgian? What is a Belgian, Liz? What is a Belgian?
These are
a
all good
Belgian is a
questions.
Dutchman or a Frank. A
Yeah.
Dutchman or a Frank or a German. There is no Belgium is just Switzerland, except I ain't putting any of my fucking money there. I'll tell you that. It does. It's Belgium. Belgium should be Israel. Not elaborate on that any further. We have you back on the show here, Ben, and we are talking about a subject that we've actually touched on with you before in one of our 9/11 episodes. But in our previous episode on NATO, which if you have not listened to, then you should go listen to that now because that will give you the entirety of the context for this. We talked about how there hasn't really been any operations, militarily speaking, by this defensive organization during the entirety of the Cold War, ostensibly its entire purpose, right? But that's actually not the case. And NATO, in fact, conducted a decades-long spree of murder and mayhem throughout Europe for very specific political and military goals. And that is sort of colloquially known as Operation Gladio. Some of you that may ring a bell or two. And if for those of you who it doesn't, we're going to ring every single one of your bells tonight.
Yeah, Gladio, I think, is I think you're right to call it the first NATO operation. It really amounted to a psychological and terror war against the European population, especially in countries that were viewed as being further to the left, like Italy. It was a violent campaign of you'd have to call it paramilitary terrorism directed by these NATO institutions and using the various states' intelligence apparatuses. And yeah, I think the idea that NATO is a defensive military alliance to protect against Soviet aggression, it's really shown to not be true by the fact that the only real military operation that they actually operationalized during the entire Cold War period was this, which was a campaign pretty much directed against civilians and consequently the political structures in Europe, specifically with an eye towards making the rise of the left impossible in countries like Italy in particular.
Now, we talked about this a little on our last episode. In fact, we talked about this extensively on our last episode. But left-wing parties were huge in much of Western Europe following the Second World War. If you look at their electoral performances, which is not always the greatest marker of actual support among the population, but almost all of them did their best in the immediate years following the Second World War. And in the case of Italy, there has been, I'm sure that, you know what, I'll never assume anything anymore. For those of you who don't know, during the Second World War, there was a large number of Italians who were like, yeah, this thing sucks and we don't want to be fascist. In fact, we're going to fight them. And they became partisans, which means they fought against their own government, in clandestine ways, but also, in the mountains. Following the war, these movements tend to pick up steam, especially as the people they're fighting against are on the back foot. And following the war, there was a huge, basically public outpouring of support for the Communist Party because they had been essentially the staunchest enemies of the fascist regime throughout the Second World War. And this was repeated throughout much of, well, I guess Italy is in Southern Europe, but throughout much of Western Europe and throughout much of Europe as a whole. And that was not looked upon kindly by the American occupiers of Italy following the Second World War. In fact, it was sort of viewed as one of the most sort of the biggest problems that they had on their hands in terms of domestic situations in other countries.
Yeah, and if you think about the goal that we discussed in the previous episode of orienting the European economy towards the Atlantic, towards the United States, towards the UK, that was the intention of the United States. The communists, beyond having the goal of turning Europe into a workers' paradise, on the much more concretely in the immediate, for instance, Tagliati, who was the head of the Italian Communist Party, he worked with the Soviet Union and Fiat to finance the opening of an auto plant in the Soviet Union, right? So this idea that that the Western European communist parties wanted to work with other elements, including capitalist elements, national bourgeois elements within the European the various European states, to orient those countries towards the Soviet Union, even if it didn't mean actually having a Marxist-Leninist form of government.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's important to point out is that in this period and in the period prior to this, during the Second World War, too, the Comintern, which was the international organization that governed communist parties, they actually took a sort of explicitly anti-revolutionary stance where they were saying, do not overthrow your governments, form these national coalitions, and essentially either take power via parliamentary means or sort of bide your time. And the left-wing parties throughout Europe, well, except for some of them, but the left-wing parties in Western and Southern Europe actually, obeyed these diktats, right? Like the French communists did not have a revolution after the Second World War, even though it probably would have been the best time for them to have done that. Well, I don't know, American military presence aside. But so that they were these parties were not revolutionary parties at this point. I think we should make that pretty clear. So there was no real threat of them storming Parliament and shooting everyone in it and putting it in a worker state or whatever. But that did not dissuade the powers that be in America and Britain and throughout the Christian democratic parties in these countries from viewing them as the primary number one threat to their countries following the war.
Yeah, there was even explicit language in some of the early drafts of the North Atlantic Treaty about the threat of I can't remember what they said. Political change favorable to an aggressor, that is to say the USSR. the idea that NATO would be directed not only against the USSR itself, but against political change that would be favorable to the USSR or seen as favorable to the USSR to these right wingers.
Yeah, that was a really sort of contentious part of the NATO drafting. In fact, I think it was Britain that put the kibosh on putting that in there.
A little too on the nose.
Exactly. They still, to be clear, dear listeners, they still did that. Like that
Right.
was still viewed as one of the primary goals of any country within NATO and NATO as a whole, was to quash any sort of political environment favorable to their enemy. And more than that, it was actually a real big goal and a real big worry among NATO planners was actually neutralism as well. And we talked about this at the end of our last episode, but the Soviet peace offensive was viewed as dangerous precisely because it led people into thinking that maybe the Soviet Union was not going to invade and wasn't our big enemy. And so why is this Cold War thing happening in the first place? And so that's really important to keep in mind, is that it wasn't just communists, but really anybody who wasn't fully on board with the goals of NATO and specifically the U.S.
Yeah, and a lot of the the gladiators, the so-called gladiators, understood.
So corny.
Yeah,
I know, it's so
but
corny.
they understood this point very explicitly, and I think the phrase strategy of tension is one that gets bandied about a bit. But I think when you put it in this context, as you just said, Brace, this idea that even if you weren't a communist, what was the point in militarizing the society, creating these sharp divisions between East and West along the lines of their communists were capitalists, so therefore we can't interact at all. There was I agree, there was this real sense in Europe that, what are we doing here? What is the point of this Cold War? But you have people like Vincenzo Vinciguerra, who was convicted for his role in the Peteano bombing, which was a right-wing paramilitary bomb, some Carabinieri, the Italian gendarmes. And he said in this documentary, this Alan Frankovich documentary about Gladio, that when you were on the right, you were supposed to attack civilians to force the Italian public to turn to the state and ask for greater security. People would willingly trade part of their freedom for the security of being able to walk the streets. This is the political logic behind all the bombings. People would trade their freedom for the security, and that idea that we have to reinvigorate this sense of warfare amongst the populace to convince them that these military institutions are legitimate, that they serve a legitimate function to protect us, and that the left, the communists, rather than create a more peaceful Europe, create a Europe that's not dominated by militarism, that they're actually going to lead us to anarchy and violence and terrorism. That was the impression that needed to be created. And the years of lead only started into the 60s, but I think it was very much anticipated that this was going to be needed, because you have allegations from pretty credible journalists in Europe who have good sources inside Italy, for instance, talking about the fact that before the Italians signed the NATO treaty, they had to sign secret documents that basically said the government must be committed to preventing the rise of left-wing forces inside the country. I mean, this was well understood, in the late 40s that this was going to be necessary.
I think it's unfortunate because in the past it feels like the past 5 or so years, maybe longer than that, Gladio itself as a phrase has become kind of a meme that has become in its memified state, detached from any kind of real political and class context. But the Gladio as a program is actually really best understood as, I think, a set of internal structures that are there to carry out a plan, like we're saying, of heightening terror and fear among the population, so that in order to shore up and expand capital state power. Right. But these structures that are that we can call the Gladio structures, I think, really, their integration in NATO. I mean, it starts early on, like you say. It's not this doesn't start with the years of lead. These bureaucratic organizations are in place at the founding of these international organizations.
Yeah, I mean, very concretely, you have Angleton in Italy,
Yeah,
Yeah, I think he was working for
Yeah.
OSS X2.
he was.
You
Yeah.
know, and he rescued Valerio Borghese, who was the commander of the Decima Mas, which was an Italian frogman death squad that went around killing partisans. And here's the American intelligence establishment rescuing him.
He was given a
And
medal for it.
yeah, and that very, you know, he very much became the Chekhov's gun, because he comes back later as part of a NATO attempted NATO coup against a moderate, sort of neutralist government in Italy. So again, just very concretely, like, they had the plans in place and they were setting up these structures and ensuring that very specific fascists who they knew would have some degree of legitimacy to the most right wing elements in the society would be around, so that when they needed them, they could deploy them, and they did deploy them.
Yeah, I think it would be a good place to say what a stay-behind agent is. I mean, this is a tactic that was not invented with Gladio. This is pretty common. I mean, frankly, it's probably been used in warfare in some form or another since the advent of like taking control of territory in warfare. But the most, I guess, historically relevant roots come from World War II, and specifically from the activities of both the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA, which was a American intelligence agency during the Second World War, and the Special Operations Executive, which was basically the British version of that. And the OSS was actually really kind of creative and good at what they did in terms of this. Ben, you mentioned X2. And that was there was a lot of X2 agents from the OSS who were parachuted into Italy and who either made contact with the partisans or were able to locate these Nazi war criminals. And a lot of these people, I want to be clear, and OSS agents were often from a different stock than you might find in the CIA. There were, in fact, actually a lot of communists and Spanish Civil War veterans even working for the OSS until eventually they were all fired before the war's end as the dust sort of settled. But there were also these elements like Angleton and Alan Dulles, who really kind of could, more than other people, see which way the wind was blowing. And so what a stay-behind agent is somebody who stays behind when an invading force comes in and either works on a partisan or resistance movement, who captures, or not captures, but rather rescues downed pilots. This was a huge component of the French resistance during the Second World War, or relays information to a government that's at war with the occupying powers. And so this was a tactic that was actually used to pretty good effect, especially in France. And so in the aftermath of the Second World War, this was, and in fact, the declining days, well, really during a lot of the Second World War, there were certain elements of the OSS and SOE who were on the lookout for men who might make good stay-behind agents in the event of another European war with, let's say, maybe a different power than Germany.
Yeah, and the way that, we talked about the way that in Germany these structures got integrated into the German state in a very formal way. Within the broader European context, who is going to be the most fervent anti-communist? It's going to be fascists and neo-fascists.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even amongst people in the OSS, and then later in the CIA who, were not themselves fascists, although many of them are,
Yes.
were, but even amongst those
functionally
who,
fascists.
yeah, exactly. Even amongst those who weren't, they saw no problem using these elements because they understood this is who's going to be motivated to actually fight, if it actually came to that. And then, of course, that's to get beyond the pretext of to fight against a Soviet invasion. Who's going to be willing to pull the trigger on their own, fellow countrymen, for our political purposes, is going to be these far right wing elements, and that is still the case to this day in countries like Ukraine today. But I think that model, even amongst those elements that were not per se fascist, they understood the utility of it. So one of the things about, we just spoke about some of the roots going back to the OSS and SOE days, but the formal structures of what became Gladio actually predate NATO, and they began to be formed under the Western Union in 1948. and then in 1949 it was made a part of NATO formally under this clandestine planning committee. And what this really represented was the subordination of European security agencies, spy agencies, to the American spy agency, to the CIA, in a very direct way. And it meant that in some cases all intelligence was passed to the Americans, to be used by them for their own purposes. They were maybe contrary to the purposes of the Italian state. And it meant that the Americans, via this clandestine planning committee, would dominate Gladio planning and what was actually executed. The Europeans had very little input, and the people who ended up, therefore, running a lot of the Italian and Belgian and German intelligence apparatus were essentially handpicked by the Americans in this way. And even if there was formal independence for the broader intelligence agency, there was still this Gladio component within the European intelligence agencies, which was managed by the U.S. and could be used to covertly, grab intelligence that nominally let's say the Italian government wouldn't want the Americans to have, just for their own national interest reasons. So incorporating all of these disparate European intelligence agencies into this apparatus was kind of the backdoor way into CIA dominance over the security agencies of Europe, which I think was a pretty crucial component, generally speaking, of American dominance in Europe. But for these specific purposes of keeping the left wing down, it was very important to make sure that ultimate power lied in the arch anti-communist country, the United States.
Yeah, there's like various testimony about, CIA representatives always being present, kind of like this like shadowy presence at CPC meetings, like whether or not they were like officially put in positions, there was always kind of like other guys there. And there was people who say there were also U.S. Forces Europe Command there, which means that's the Pentagon. Like, so there's a lot of, let's say, U.S. influence happening in these organizations.
Yeah, if you think about the structure of NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, right? The commander of all
Which,
NATO.
by the way, can we just say that is like the creepiest fucking name for?
Yeah. It's a very World War II.
It's
totally
crazy.
They just never. They were like,
it's esoteric sounding. I'm sorry.
They,
Supreme Allied Commander sounds like.
I feel like after the 50s, they stopped calling people like the Supreme something.
Yeah.
Right? And I guess Supreme Leader, but Supreme Allied Command. It's like they can't change the name now.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's
but that is
psycho sounding.
Yeah, especially when I say Sakier, that's what
all the
it
sounds like out of a movie.
I feel like they did. I feel like they did that for because it sounds like a French word. They're like did that for to give them a bone.
But every single Supreme Allied Commander of Europe has been American.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just baked into how NATO operates. If you needed any further proof of American domination of NATO, I mean, that's it right there. And the CPC was a part of that office. So it was directly controlled by the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, who was always an American general. So just in terms of bureaucratically, organizationally, it was very much an American project. But it did have a big British component as well, but especially that American element.
Yeah, I want to just pause for a second and then just kind of like, a little throwback to the previous episode. So if in the last episode we're talking about the, American exportation of productive forces and like the kind of American mode of production, capitalist production, in service of expanding American hegemony, like throughout Europe. And then you have the basically implantation of American security services at the highest offices of like European spy centers, basically. You can kind of see how this is like a dual approach for dominating Europe, right?
Well, I think this sort of like centralization, and I'm talking here in terms of like information flowing upwards to Americans, on this level, I don't think has ever existed, right? I mean, if you were in the CIA, you had unprecedented access to allied intelligence agencies that probably didn't even exist, between like you had relationships with them that they didn't have with each other.
Right.
And specifically in the context of the Cold War, that is really, really important. And it's important to maintain American dominance because you also have, you have one of the biggest spy agencies in the world. You have one of the most famous ones, and you have a lot of input, let's say, on how other ones are run. As we'll see, quite a lot of input on how other spy agencies are run.
It's kind of funny when you think about that in terms of like, remember when like Germany and everyone was so upset about the Snowden revelations, finding out the
Yeah.
NSC was like tapping Merkel or whatever.
Yeah.
And you're
I'd
like,
love to
bro,
tap
NATO's
Merkel.
all up in you. What do you,
Yeah.
you know?
I'd love to tap Merkel in both ways.
Yeah, I knew
If you know what I mean. Double tap. I'd love to double tap her in both. I'm just kidding.
Is there some kind of mother complex going on here?
It's a stepmother complex with Brace.
She's a grandmother. Are you kidding me?
Well, a grandmother's a type of mother, isn't that right?
Yeah, it's true. What is a grandmother but a mother twice? I've always said that.
I think that the idea that it was a spoken hub model, I think that's very important because that is very commonly the American approach. That's the American approach in East Asia, for instance, that they don't interact with each other. They come back to the United States. And I think, if you want to forestall, some kind of, the European intelligence agencies getting together in some kind of coordinated way, I mean, that's kind of a necessity to keep them separated from one another. And crucially, when they are discussing with one another, there's always a CIA person in the back of the room taking notes, right? So, I mean, like very literally, that's what was happening. So I think that's crucial. And then, implicit in all of this is the role that security services actually play in the countries themselves. It's not just about collecting intelligence for the purposes of furthering your national interests. It's also about managing. A big part of what security agencies actually do is help manage the political situation.
Yeah.
And so, if the security agency is nominally reporting to the prime minister, then that means that if you get a moderate neutralist, Aldo Moro, kind of type prime minister in there, he's going to change things up. He's going to put his people in. But if they're not actually in reality subordinated to the prime minister, if there are actually these secret agreements which have been formed amongst the NATO countries that are explicitly about preventing that kind of political change from happening, then they can much more effectively serve that role. Again, because in the United States, that anti-communism was much more stable than it was in these European countries who, as far as the Americans and the British were concerned, were not fit to manage their own political systems.
I think it's sort of hard to fathom now, but for several decades following the Second World War, in America, I think a lot of people, people can kind of see it, but maybe not see it in the actual context it was in. Like there was essentially the FBI function as political police. We see it now, we have these kind of names for like COINTELPRO and stuff like that, but really like their core function is as political police. And this in Europe was actually, I would say, even more of intense a presence from intelligence agencies, raiding political meetings, taking down the names of everybody. This was a huge component to domestic intelligence agencies. I feel like they've never really had to do that as heavily in America. For whatever cultural reason.
Part of that is also because of the way that we don't have a parliamentary system in the same way, and we don't have a party system in the same way. And so there really was never a threat of any kind of actual communist or socialist, even like leadership in any, legislative.
I think also the class compromise was much more stable in the U.S. For just a variety of economic. Yeah, exactly, and that is the model that the U.S. was imposing on Europe, with not 100% complete success. So you needed these much more violent means of ensuring that the workers did not rock the boat.
And its imposition on Europe also shores up its power at home, right, and makes it stronger. So
yeah.
So I think we got to get to the 1948 elections in Italy. And so I feel like we've set the scene enough for you guys, where Italy, war-torn country, large communist party that is very popular, heavy Western presence, especially, in terms of money and troops and stuff like that. And there are elections. And these elections were extremely important. They were crucial. And for a variety of reasons, number one of which is that the communists, and in fact, the communists were in I believe, a coalition with the Socialist Party. Italian Socialist Party is also a very big party. It's not, it's a lot. Most social democratic parties were pretty big in Western Europe at the time, but the Italians and the communists were in a coalition. I think the Popular Democratic Front, which is just the three, that's like the most basic name you can have your left-wing coalition be. It's just you'll say it and then won't remember it a second later. And they were actually projected to win. There were opinion polls going out, and they were showing that the communists were slated to do, if not win, but to do very, 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 very well. So like in most Western European countries, I guess probably in most European countries at this point, there's also a Christian Democratic Party, which is generally like the center-right to right-wing party, in the largest center-right to right-wing party. I feel like countries either have a big Christian Democratic Party or they have a big like right-wing People's Party.
Yeah.
Like those are the two kinds of right-wing, like generic right-wing parties that you have.
Yeah, if you can imagine like immediately post-war in Europe, right? I mean, the war basically destroyed the old political arrangement. Like basically all of the right-wing parties have been pretty thoroughly discredited by their association with fascism. And so what's left, like the socialists and the communists, all the liberal parties were basically irrelevant at this point for a variety of reasons. Basically, they didn't have any real contact with the working class, and the old classes that these liberal parties used to represent didn't really exist as much anymore after the war. So what's left? It's like the church, essentially. And so that's why you're left with these Christian Democrats become the default right-wing American support. And they gave tons of money to all of them. In Germany, you had the Christian Democratic Union, the Christian Social Union.
Merkel.
You had exactly. And in Italy, you had the DCI, the Christian Democrats of Italy. Yeah.
And I got to tell you, the CIA, they knew a good bet when they saw one. So the U.S. government saw that this Communist Party is gaining a ton of power in what is a pretty crucial Western European state that America needs to have control over. And they could not let this happen by any means. And they see the Christian Democrats as their best and really only bet in order for that not to happen.
Yeah, and they gave a ton. They gave, I think, as much as $20 million. The CIA gave directly to the DCI. You had money coming from Western multinationals like oil. Some of the oil majors were giving lots of money.
Wait, yeah, Ben, dude, I got in a hole the other night reading about Exxon and Mobil before they merged, them giving money to Italian parties. But it's insane because they actually gave money at one point to the Communist Party too. I think later in like the maybe the 80s. But in the 70s, they were giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Socialist Party of Proletarian Unity, like just like a small, like, I don't know, probably in the tens of thousands of membership Communist Party in Italy. Getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from Exxon is insane to me. But they were financing, I mean, in addition to all the money from the CIA, Exxon was literally giving tens of millions of dollars to the Christian Democrats. So they were breaded the fuck up. I mean, I'm not knocking them for that.
Yeah, it was a huge push, and it was very, this is such a crucial operation because it was one of the first, big American post-war covert operations.
Yeah.
It was actually the document that outlined the policy was actually NSC-1. It was the very first NSC, National Security Committee document after that body had been created. And, they said that the Italian government, which is ideologically inclined towards Western democracy, it's the birthplace of Western civilization in many respects, right? It's weak and it's being subjected to continuous attack by a strong communist party. So that was their impression of the situation, that we need to repel this advance. And the NSC directed the CIA to give money. Voice of America broadcast all kinds of propaganda. They were printing, defamatory, just making shit up about, people having affairs and even more outrageous, slanderous things than that.
Oh, that's just Italians.
Yeah, well, exactly.
But they also were, we should say they were also arming paramilitaries in the event that all the money that they were funding to the DCI failed.
Yeah, absolutely. Cossiga, who was the interior minister under the DCI at a later date, he said openly, I know they gave me a Sten submachine gun and grenades, and if the communists won, we were gonna fight a war. I mean, that they were very much prepared for that eventuality, and there would have been political violence if the communists had won.
I mean, I think it is pretty extraordinary that if the Communist Party in Italy and the Socialist Party, it should be noted, which is in later years became very accommodating to NATO.
Yeah.
If these parties had won a democratic election, a free and fair election in Italy in the 1940s, there would have been almost certainly an invasion by the United States of America, and those people would have been killed or driven into exile. It's pretty extraordinary to think about right now. Like the entire course of Italian history, essentially since World War II, has been dictated by a series, and especially this one, decisions made by the United States government.
Which is why NATO gets the big bucks.
Yeah. I gotta say, if you're an Italian, you kind of gotta feel like a pussy for not having done it.
I think all Italians feel that secretly.
Yeah, I don't know what they feel. I like them though.
Me too.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine what Europe would have looked like if that had happened. I mean, because it would have made overt very many things that were already happening covertly.
Yeah.
But so it's hard to imagine if the U.S. had gone in and done that, what the effect would have been on Europe. So the fact that it didn't happen, I think, is a shame, and really set the stage for this. I mean, the socialists, for instance, the communist, we could talk about Euro-communism, but the socialists were opposed to NATO in the first place.
And
remained opposed to Italy's membership in NATO through the 60s. And later became, another, essentially social liberal, social democratic party.
Yeah. Well, so did the Communist Party for that.
Exactly. But at that time, it was a very different story, and there was a very different set of factors. And the fact that it went the way that it did, I think, set the stage for a lot of the tragedy that was to follow in Western Europe.
Yeah, ultimately, the Christian Democrats actually won the election, as you can imagine. So some of the heavy foreshadowing we've done here, and the Popular Front, I think, came in, or they did come in second, I think with 4 million less votes. And it was actually a shock to people in Italy at the time. I think people had really expected, and I'm sure there was some chicanery with the voting process. I mean, if even if the CIA wasn't involved, I've been to Greece, and that's close enough. I know how things work down there. I want to be clear. I love any country where you live with your mom for basically your whole life. And I'm not joking. That's my favorite countries are ones where you just kind of never move out. And everyone sort of just gets more rotund, but wears less and less clothing as the days go on. But the Christian Democrats take power, which basically forever sets the course of Italy after that.
Yeah, and the obviously the year of 1948 is crucial because the following year Italy joined NATO.
Yeah, what a coincidence!
And also had because as you said, this idea of political police that's really what security agencies are, and because the experience of Europe at that point had been the Gestapo. Yeah, so people understood what these organizations are about. They had many of them had firsthand experience with it. And so it was only when the Christian Democrats had, secured that victory that the Italian government could create a security agency, an intelligence agency, internal security. And that happens just before NATO accedes Italy accedes to the NATO treaty. So I think that context is crucial because, Italy's NATO status remains a controversial issue basically until the end of the 1960s. And so the fact that this election was won and then they entered NATO, it's very hard to get yourself back out of that at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also fair to say that the formation of the Italian security agency was a prerequisite to joining NATO, right? Because
absolutely.
there was no use for them in this organization, in this alliance, if there was no sharing of intelligence and no gathering of intelligence and no carrying out of these kind of Gladio, what we'll come to learn, Gladio missions, because that's the entire point, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we were alluding to the idea that all of these intelligence agencies become subordinated to the CIA, and that happens very explicitly with SIFAR, which is the first of many. They repeatedly get themselves into controversy, so they have to shut it down and start a new one.
Yeah.
Every other decade, basically.
It's a great move.
Yeah, it's a winning. Change your brand name, right? That's the way out, right?
Sifar has got to be one of my favorite names too, because it sounds. I mean, I like it. You got to have the intelligence agency sound evil,
right?
It
Sifar,
sounds
I think-
crazy evil.
I think
it sounds
next-
like a Disney villain.
Yeah, obviously Gestapo is the most evil sounding one.
Sure.
But Savak too, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the Shah's secret police, my favorite app by far, Savak, because it's just you get
really
I gotta
feel
tell
it.
you. I don't have any context. I'm like, you're like, oh, you're gonna get arrested by the CIA. I'd be like, what is that? I didn't pay taxes. Someone's like, you're getting arrested by Savak. I'm like, all right, well, just kill me now.
Yeah, Sifar sounds a little bit like Cypher too. Like there's some real. It's a very rich name. Yeah, too bad they had to get rid of it because they bombed some people and killed a bunch of people.
Yeah. People tend to frown on that.
Yeah, some of these quotes from some of these documents. There's an NSC document that Truman signed that said, in case the communists successfully enter the government by legal means, the United States have to be prepared to take countermeasures.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Operation Demagnetize documents those were written in 1952. The limitation of the strength of the communists in Italy and France is a top priority objective. This objective has to be reached by the employment of all means, right? All means.
Mm-hmm.
The Italian and French government may know nothing of the plan, for it is clear that the plan can interfere with their respective national sovereignty. I mean, they understood exactly what they were doing, and they understood what the threat was posed, and they stated it in very plain terms in these internal documents that this was their plan. They were gonna fight the left by all means, which would include political terrorism.
I think it's important too to know the time period here, which is the early 50s. It's right after NATO started, and NATO actually had some rocky ground for about its first decade. It was on rocky ground for about its first decade. A lot of these countries had traditionally not worked well together. Some of them had even been recently at war with one another. And so there were quite a few kinks to work out. And what you can see here is, like, obviously there are political and military considerations in taken into account with making sure the communists don't achieve power. But a huge part of that too was they need to strengthen NATO. Is they need to make this alliance a real, actual alliance, and not just a collection of country names that sign at the bottom of a treaty. Keeping the left out and keeping the Christian Democrats in is a hugely important component of that. And the U.S. was going to take essentially any effort they could to do it. They would do.
So when you flash forward to the Kennedy administration, which starts in January 1961, you can see, if you read Vanderpyle's book about the formation of the Atlantic ruling class, the Kennedy administration was sort of the third big push of liberal internationalism. Again,
we're still living in that, by the way.
Oh yeah. Oh, that was a final.
Some of the entrails of it.
Absolutely, yeah. The exhaustion of it as a project is now with us today for sure. But it was still the many of the things that the liberal internationalists had wanted to achieve, such as decolonization, had not yet been completed. And that's really what the reason why Kennedy, to the degree that he has any progressive cred at all, is basically because of his push for decolonization as against the British and the French. And that another thing that he favored was a much less violent. Well, I shouldn't say much less, a slightly less violent approach. Certainly, let's continue American domination of Europe, but let's try to do it more subtly. Let's try to do it with less violence. So, for instance, he seemed to believe that there could be a reconciliation, not with the communists for sure, but with the socialists, that we could begin to bring the socialists and incorporate them into the European political scene. This happened in Germany. This happened this happened everywhere. And this basically is the beginning of the change of the socialists from a real revolutionary socialist party, oriented towards, at the very least, nationalization, socialization, to just, social democracies, essentially, which is where we are now.
I mean, you see this all throughout Europe, and the socialist parties and the big social democratic / socialist parties, sometimes they're called the Social Democratic Party, like in the case of Germany. Sometimes, I think in France, it's the Socialist Party. Although I liked when they were called like the French section of the First International or whatever, which they were for much of their history. There was the sort of mid-century was a big time of turmoil from these parties because there was sort of no longer a revolutionary socialist element among the working class, but there was a pretty big, oftentimes middle class, sort of accommodationist social democratic element. And you see kind of how what's that turned into today, which is these parties are, I mean, lockstep with NATO and they are, I mean, they make AOC look like, Che Guevara or something. But yeah, in Italy there was a pretty big struggle over that because Italians love to. I mean, they had Garibaldi, man, one of the coolest revolutionaries in history. I mean, there's a lot of revolutionary sentiment among Italian people, or there was, and that had to work itself out with the Italian Socialist Party.
Yeah, and I think if you think about it, one of the key components of kind of the liberal internationalist approach is a labor capital compromise,
Yes.
right? You don't want to do full fascism where it's just full on military repression of the working class. So let's work out an accommodation with them. I think that was a big part of incorporating the socialist parties into that kind of arrangement in Europe.
Yeah.
Was taking place, and arguably was taking place over the course of the 50s as well. But I think Kennedy, in the case of Italy, he didn't see a problem with the socialists coming to power potentially, even though even at this point in the early 60s, the socialists in Italy were opposed to NATO. They were opposed to Italy's membership in NATO. I don't think, perhaps Kennedy thought, well, that's not really that big a threat. That's not ever going to happen. And, once Italy's in, they're not going to leave. But there was a lot of opposition within the American establishment to that. They wanted, ironclad DCI control permanently. Yes. And this became a huge issue. I think, a lot of wheeling and dealing inside the American intelligence apparatus, which led to serious problems in Italy. So, basically the DCI has one of their worst electoral performances ever in 1963. So they get 38%. And the communists and the socialists, who are now no longer in a coalition together as part of this popular front that they had been in the late 40s, they get more than the Christian Democrats did. I think they got 39% or 40%, something like that. So Aldo Moro, who is this more moderate, compared to Andreotti, for instance, or Cossiga, who are very right-wing elements within the DCI, Aldo Moro is much more moderate. He's a more neutralist, person who wants to, have some more accommodation with these left-wing elements. Again, part of that move towards social democratic compromise that takes hold in Europe. And he basically says, look, if you're not going to let me bring the communists in the government, obviously, but I do have to bring some of these socialists into my government as cabinet ministers.
You can't. Yeah, you don't have a majority government.
Right. I don't have a majority. I need them. There are some smaller parties that won, some of that remaining 20%, but that's not enough to push me over the edge. So I need to bring the socialists into government. And so this kicks off, I think, probably longstanding planning for a coup, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just called the Piano Solo coup. The kind of on the ground guy was this guy, Giovanni Di Lorenzo. He had been the head of SIFAR, and he was essentially ordered by the CIA to take action against this, against Aldo Moro forming this coalition government. So he was Cossiga made him I think Andreotti at the time was the defense minister. He made De Lorenzo the head of the Carabinieri, which is like the gendarmes in Italy. We don't really have that in the U.S., I guess, but it's essentially it's kind of like our police are basically that at this point, but it was essentially
like tanks and stuff.
It's like a federal paramilitary police, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, and they like full on, like they have APCs, they have tanks. They don't have quite have tanks, but like that kind of,
it's
like
they're
mechanized.
DHS for us.
I will
but
say,
you don't
like,
see it deployed domestically as much as at the border. Right?
I would agree. Yeah, they're basically our version of gendarmes. But also, like, the shittiest small town has like a fucking MRAP now.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, it's very much the Americans have adopted that in their own way. But they were able to do this very subtle coup where this guy Di Lorenzo is put in charge of the Carabinieri, and he also has these Gladio elements that are commanded by the military intelligence at this point, the SID, and they set up shop in Rome. and they're essentially on standby to occupy important facilities, the TV station, the radio station, all the classic, coup targets. And then De Lorenzo meets with Moro and says, look, we're going to need to do this the easy way or the hard way, right? Either you take these socialist ministers out of your cabinet, or there's going to be a coup, and the choice is yours, essentially. And Moro was cowed by that, as I think, pretty understandably, frankly. And they allowed him to bring in a few of their more acceptable socialist ministers. They gave them the kind of crappy, they gave them health and human services. You know what I mean? Those kinds of things that the establishment is not really very concerned with. And that was that. And Moro's attempt to form a truly representative of the electoral, situation was stopped by this military, this covert military force. And that becomes, that happens much later in Italy as well. But that kind of intervention at the behest of the CIA to subvert Italian democracy, even against these, relatively speaking, moderate left-wing elements, who were well on their way to becoming, just another cog in the European political architecture. That was not acceptable, to the point that they had to enact this longstanding plan to push that back.
I think with Italy, we mentioned the years of lead earlier, and we did talk about this on a previous episode too. I'll try to figure out which 9/11. I won't do this, but
I think it's the 5th.
It's the one about false flags.
Yeah.
But the Gladio structure in Italy developed into something that I would say was more advanced even than most other countries. It became a huge colossus, this sort of like underground behemoth that combined elements of the church, the military, fascist organizations, the mafia, and intelligence agencies from all over Europe, into basically a criminal political force, or paramilitary criminal political force that was designed to cause terror, to kill civilians, and to prevent by any means necessary a left-wing or even neutralist government. You mentioned Aldo Moro. Aldo Moro was, of course, later killed, and his body, left midway between the Communist Party and the Christian Democratic headquarters. That was blamed on the Red Brigades, and there is a lot of. We'll see some allusions to some similar questions about the Red Brigades when we talk about Belgium. That's basically understood now to have been, if not a Gladio operation, then certainly any chance of him being rescued went out the window the minute that the U.S. government and the Italian government got together and started talking, negotiating for his release. They were not interested in that whatsoever. There was huge train station bombings where hundreds of people died. There were constant, it was gunfire at any kind of left-wing political office. Scores of people were assassinated, murdered. Bombs were planted and then blamed on the left. The police would break into left-wing politicians' houses and plant bomb parts to try to implicate them in crimes. And this happened for years and years and years and years. A huge component about this is the so-called stay-behind organizations that NATO set up within Italy with neo-fascist or fascist Italians in order to resist a Soviet invasion. And they decided to be proactive and not just resist a Soviet invasion, but actually to resist even moderate social democracy. And so this was essentially what you got with NATO's plan for Italy. You had years of torture, murders, rapes, arson, all in the name of fighting against communism, but really in a sort of larger sense, in the name of causing political terror so that people will, they'll be less neutralist when it comes to the government. And it's sort of extraordinary. A lot of this came out in 1990. There was a parliamentary commission. I was reading the documents. Someone had FOIA'd the Italian embassy, American embassy in Rome, rather's cables back to America during all of this. And it's really funny to see the ambassador clearly doesn't know what some of this stuff is. And so he's like, they're talking about something called the CPC in Italian parliament. Do we have a response to that?
Most of the architecture of this it's like NATO architecture. So it's
yes.
it's hard to call it anything else. It's just like its concrete NATO architecture was basically unknown to the member countries
Yes.
up until some of the little bit of revelations that we got from the parliamentary hearings in some of the European countries starting in 1990. But even then, like, France has denied that it had any kind of stay behind network, which is just a lie. It's not true. Um, and Andreotti himself said that the ACC, the Allied Clandestine Committee, which is kind of a later iteration of the CPC, was like he says that their most recent meeting, which the French branch, he says, was present for, was October 23rd and 24th in 1990. And he said that in 1990.
Right.
Well, there's only like a month and like 10 days left in 1990 in that case.
I mean, to this day, the U.S. and the CIA, the MI6, I mean, they just straight up deny that NATO says that the CPC never existed.
Yeah.
They have no record of it. I mean, if you ask them, none of this stuff happened. None of these organizations existed, despite, as you say, I mean, Andreotti, who would know. I mean, he was practically. I mean, some of the tenor of some of the things he said, he was practically bragging about his role in this.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And I mean, of course, by 1990 they had won, right? So there's a lot to brag about. But I think, Brace, what you were talking about, just the scope of who was involved in this and the level at which it operated, it seems rather petty on the one hand to have, these fascist paramilitaries enabled by the state to, set off a car bomb and kill a few Carabinieri. But then on the opposite end of that, you have this coup, which involved, the gendarme apparatus of the Italian state to have a coup against the elected prime minister, like and all of it was certainly compartmentalized, but I think a part of a much broader strategy that was able to find all of these different disparate elements and bring them together, both on the legitimate end of the state, the secret elements of the state, and then these covert underground, fascist paramilitaries. That's a hell of an unholy alliance,
Yeah. Which, by the way, is actually how I first was introduced to Gladio, when I downloaded the Unholy Alliance audiobook as the first audiobook I ever got, I think in 2010. Less people think that, oh, well, Gladio, that's just some shit that Italians are always getting up to trouble. I mean, they invented the mafia and the Pope, for Christ's sake. Wrong. I mean, this occurred. We're not going to get into this in for every country, but this occurred in basically every single European country, east of the wall, you might say, or west of the wall, rather. Even non-NATO countries like Austria, for example, a bunch of arms caches were found in Austria in the 1990s. The government there claims they had no idea, but doubt it. But,
which, by the way, sorry, just to interrupt, that is crazy because Austria was neutral.
Yeah, Austria's supposed to be neutral. So is Switzerland, by the way.
And Switzerland had these same structures as well.
Switzerland, I will say, Switzerland is never not been neutral.
Yeah.
No, but they're not. They're ostensibly, right?
Yes.
They're they claim neutrality, and I would say that every just walking around normal person would be like, oh yeah, the Swiss, they're neutral. That's like the thing that about them.
And people in those countries they favored neutrality. I mean, they wanted to be neutral because it meant not being involved in this. They still lived under the umbrella of it, but it meant not being involved in this militaristic. And for in Austria's case, I mean, I think it was a pretty direct response to the fascist, history of that country during the war. So to then involve them in this clandestine. Covert paramilitaries. It was not activated in Austria to the degree that it was in other countries like Italy and Belgium. But the fact that was done was a huge violation of the country's sovereignty and the will of the people to be a neutral, country.
I think Belgium is an important one to raise here because I don't know. I have no idea what the common perception of the Belgian is. I can tell you my own feelings towards that country, which is, I mean, you're Dutch, or you're French, or you're German. I don't know why you're Belgian. It's confusing to me. I don't want to know. I don't know what Walloon is. That's weird to say that for me as an American. I'm just saying that. And I am very sorry that my country did do a bunch of what looks like armed terror in yours. But I think for our sort of second case study here, shows how I would assume, I mean, Italy is its own beast, right? I don't think, I mean, obviously all of these countries had different Gladio programs, but Italy has such a entrenched deep state that I think it took on even a more advanced form than it did other places. I think Belgium probably gives us more of an example of what it likely looked like, or what it did look like in a lot of Western European countries. I mean, it's somewhat similar to Germany's as well, because there was a pretty large stay-behind network there as well.
Yeah, and the Belgian political situation, like a lot of European countries, you had communists and socialists in the government. You had serious concern about the possibility of them becoming a majority. And so the same kinds of impetus that existed to create this organization in Italy and the rest of Europe existed in Belgium as well. And, I mean, one of the things that happened was the leader of the Communist Party in Belgium was assassinated in 1950.
Yeah.
Paul-Henri Spaak, who was the head of, he was the second NATO Secretary General. He has he's definitely alluded to the fact, and if you read between the lines, it seems pretty clear from some of the things that he said that assassination was a part of an MI6 operation that certain elements within Belgium were a part of.
Yeah, basically the Belgians, I mean, the communists had like 21 seats in parliament after the war. They were pretty popular. And the UK and the US were, I think they were pretty nervous about that. And there wasn't really anyone left besides the old monarchists to bring in.
Well, this is the problem. When you collaborate heavily with the Nazis during World War II, as basically, I mean, especially against the communists. I was reading I actually think it might have been another Rand paper. But no, I don't think it was some kind of think tank paper from the 70s. I was reading last night, and they talked about how, like, really in the aftermath of World War II, there was not a lot of options besides the communists in terms of people who hadn't collaborated. And the people who had collaborated had basically waged a war against communists during the entirety of World War II in collaboration with the Germans. And so that's the political situation we're left with.
Yeah. Julian Lehout, the communist leader, he basically was shot right after they reinstalled the king, who was like, I don't know if he was the second son or third son. He was a Leopoldist.
I feel like his dad couldn't come back because he had been too nice to the Nazis.
Yeah.
So they were like, oh, well, my son.
But I can't remember, was it his son or his grandson? I can't remember.
I don't know.
But so they basically like reinstall him. And Lehout was like, at that reinstallation, he like shouts out, "Long live the Republic." He's trying to fight as a Republican, and was just like shot and killed 2 days or so later. You mentioned Paul-Henri Spaak. He was the prime minister at the time, though later, like you said, he becomes the Secretary General, I think. And he basically has come out and said that, like you said, it's strongly suggested that this was a joint operation between the US, the UK, and the Belgian security services, aka NATO, basically, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Belgium was integrated into this architecture pretty early.
Yeah.
And there was already this free trade zone in the Benelux countries, so I think it was one of the more advanced countries early on in terms of some of these plans being implemented. And that assassination did create a huge political vacuum in Belgium, because, as you said, who was left at that point? But it did open the door to a lot of these right-wing operators. I think if you think about like the trifecta of European, defense ministers who tried to take control of their country, some of them were, Paul van den Boynants in Belgium would be a big one. And he was also like an arch pedophile and a variety of other unsavory things. So exactly the kind of person that NATO would want in charge of a country like Belgium, therefore. So it created these, the destruction of the old liberal parties and the destruction of the Communist Party, essentially, by that assassination and various other means. left you with essentially a Christian Democratic Party, which was a tool of the United States.
Yeah, I believe in 1952, in 1950, two, there was pretty heavy political repression against the Communist Party there, and they were basically like excised from public life in a bunch of different ways. But this was not good enough for our good friends at NATO. And with this in mind, and with a potential Soviet invasion in mind, they set up a pair of stay-behind groups, one civilian and one military.
Yeah, the SDRA-8, which talk about like spy name, like that is that
That's a
feels
really
like a
good one.
classic. This
Yeah,
one's even better.
that's a good one.
STC/mob,
Yeah,
which is
I
like
like that one
yeah,
too.
it's like pretty intense sounding.
You can tell that has some CIA involvement because they love putting slash something.
Yeah,
right.
Totally. So the SDRA-8 were basically like military men. So these were guys like trained in combat, sabotage, paratroopers, maritime guys, the Classico style.
Mhm.
And then the SGC mob were the civilian branch, which that makes it sound like, oh, that's nice. But these were guys that were predominantly recruited from groups with, this is a direct quote, strong religious convictions as a guarantee for their anti-communism. Now, we mentioned the monarchists, but if you think of maybe kind of, let's say, like recent examples of fundamentalist or extreme right-wing organizations, groups like ISIS, you can think of what kind of groups there would be in Western Europe at the time that would have such strong beliefs that could be a guarantee for their anti-communism, right? These are like civilian outreach to like fascists, basically.
Yeah, I mean, Belgium had a pretty big fascist party in the years leading up to the Second World War, the Rexists.
Yeah.
Who always, I'll be real, the Rexists always seemed a little pathetic to me.
Well, Belgium.
Like, they couldn't really get their shit in order. I think the guy who made Tintin was a Rexist.
Yes.
Which is funny to me. That little guy is always getting into some trouble.
I think the dog is cute.
I think the dog should die.
So, I mean, we've spent a good amount of time talking about the kind of different political tensions, but I do think it's good for us to kind of get into the nitty gritty of how these networks actually functioned, like on the level. So, I mean, they are kind of like classic spy style. I mean, I don't know how to say it. Like, if you read spy novels, if you've seen movies, like it does all feel or it will sound very familiar. So the Belgian like stay behind agents like very likely knew very little of like what they were actually accomplishing on a kind of like larger political scale. They were kind of, they're like all kind of networks. They're set up with agents and instructors. So you have like one advising the other, and they had a kind of cell structure so that, as instructors would go abroad, they would build their own networks, and there would be kind of like a pyramid scheme of recruiting like fascist spies, basically. Right.
Yeah, it's all compartmentalized because if one guy gets arrested for something, maybe he's shooting some mine workers or something, and he gets arrested, you don't want him to be able to name everyone on the network.
Yeah. And so for the like STC mob side, on the civilian side, they would most likely, they wouldn't know each other's names at all, even. They wouldn't know their instructors' names. They would have like no indication.
It's like FetLife.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But these guys operated completely independently of the Belgian army. And so in order to do so, they had to have like as little of information as possible about each other. There were, you mentioned in the Austrian example, but there would be secret arms caches like spread throughout the country, guns, munitions, gold, explosives. And there were extensive radio networks that were set up, and this continues to this day, but there were installed there were harpoon networks at the time that were established through the country. And it's the Belgian justice minister has testified that these were brought in, implemented, and like actually bought by NATO itself. These are NATO radio networks that were installed to manage communication between all of these kind of fascist paramilitaries.
Yeah, I think the communication point is crucial because you need to have a way for these elements to communicate with one another that is not a part of the traditional communication, routes within the military. You don't want to produce documentation on your secret, covert, paramilitary terrorist organization. So you've got to have a secret way of getting information between them. And yeah, it was like top end NATO equipment, cryptographically secure, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, there's not going to be, nobody's going to hear this, and you can basically say whatever you want, in an age when, that kind of communication was not easy to come by, right? If you're not doing that, you're having to do, dead drops and payphones and that kind of thing. So it made that kind of coordination for these kinds of terrorist attacks a lot easier and directly, like you said, directly financed by NATO.
Yeah, Michael Van Oersel, great Belgian name, who was a member of the SGC mob, he gave testimony. He said, "One day a man came to my house and asked me if I would accept a confidential mission."
I hate when that happens.
He said that it was something within the framework of NATO. So just as an aside, this is explicit, by the way, that is told to people. Our base was near London, with a second base near Boston, interesting, in the United States. And so these SDR-8 forces were like trained in the US, participated in actual NATO exercises at the direction of US Special Forces within not just their own countries, but like other countries within the US sphere of influence. And these NATO exercises, by the way, they would have nothing to do with a potential Soviet invasion whatsoever.
No.
And a lot of times ended up being terror attacks, as we'll see. They were under the guise of being like NATO exercises that would be terror attacks on local civilian town, like just towns and shit. It's crazy.
Well, I think the training in other countries is an important part because you see that over and over again with a lot of Gladio stuff, is that people are flown to America or flown to Britain and trained in, basically what essentially amounts to special forces training, oftentimes given to civilians with, let's say, extremist politics. And then returned home and told, well, just, sit tight. Don't use any of those skills, brother. Like, just hang out until the Soviet Union invades. And I gotta say, some sympathy for these guys, because you're like, you're reading the newspaper, you're like, all right, Soviets still invaded. I gotta shoot somebody. And boy, in the case of Belgium, shoot somebody they did do indeed. What a sentence structure I got there.
Well, there's a couple. There's the big Brabant massacres that we should talk about because that's like one of the most traumatic experiences, I think, in Belgian history, and it's quite recent. The other one that I want to mention is the Vilsam incident, which is basically like one of those exercises gone awry. So in 1984, U.S. Marines set out from an airport just like north of London. Over Belgium, they parachuted into an area where they basically met up with SDR-8 agents, SDR-8. I'm just going to butcher that. I'm sorry. Also, it's funny how it looks like straight.
Yeah. Right?
That's weird. Anyway. So both the U.S. Marines and the SDR-8 agents, they set up camp in like a secret isolated location, and they start getting ready for their operation, which was to attack a police station in this very, very quiet rural town called Vilsam. The U.S. Marines open fire on this police station. They kill a Belgian warrant officer. And this town, this small town is like, what the fuck? This is fucking crazy.
Yeah, Red Dawn.
Yeah, well,
exactly.
It was Red Dawn because they found a bunch of the weapons that were stolen from that police station. And they, funny enough, ended up in a flat belonging to one of the, communist cell combatants. I can't say that name in French or Belgian, whatever the hell it is. The CCC, the alleged
communist combat cells. Yeah.
Basically, like, they planted a bunch of the stolen weapons in the communist cells to frame them for this terror attack on the police station. And so you see this like twofold attack. This like, this kind of like twofold goal is accomplished, which we then see kind of repeated throughout these Gladio exercises, which is one, you put the Belgian local police, which is not aware of the kind of false flag insider nature of the attack, right? Mm-hmm. It puts them on the ready, and they genuinely believe they need to shore up support and expand their presence because they were just attacked by, they were just
Someone
shot
just
at
came
and
in
attacked.
and iced you. Yeah.
Yeah. And two, it makes it seem like this very like comfortable and like quiet, wealthy like area in Belgium is on the brink of communist revolution.
Yeah. Well, there's some weird. The CCC, like a lot of these groups, is there's a lot of. I'm thinking specifically of the Red Brigades. There's sort of a lot of debate over whether they're actually like either like a cutout or a front group, which I guess is the same thing in this instance, for intelligence agencies or for the right wing as well. Eventually, the leader I think did get busted and went to prison Euro style for like 5 years. Which doesn't, I mean, to be clear, that part doesn't mean anything because it's impossible to go to prison in Europe for more than like a month. But yeah, there was a, I mean, it's an extraordinary coincidence in a series of extraordinary coincidences.
So the big one in the kind of Belgian history with these stay behind armies is the Brabant massacre, which was, or massacres. It was really a set of basically 16 armed assaults, massive terror attacks that happened right around Brussels between 1983 and 1985. Which, by the way, I just want to point out, like, so we had been talking about the kind of political situation in Italy in 1948, and we are now in the mid to
Yeah, that's a
early
good
to
point.
mid 80s in Belgium. Like there's a continuation here. This program, like we're only bringing two instances here to that we're talking about in this episode, but like this was going on for decades throughout Western Europe, right?
Yeah.
But we are now like 40 years later in the future.
And this time period, this period of like I think really 1983 was when a lot of the anti-cruise missile protests really kicked off. Because these cruise missiles had been developed that could be placed in Europe and could hit targets in the Soviet Union pretty quickly. They could have nuclear weapons on them. These are like when Tomahawk missiles started to really become a key part of the American arsenal. And that really like started to change the security situation. It started to change the mutually assured destruction equation. And a lot of the left, and even just liberals and things were very opposed to this. And there were big protests about denuclearizing Europe, getting these ensuring that these cruise missiles wouldn't be put in the Netherlands, and I think some of them were going to be put in Belgium. So I think that context of this sort of repoliticization in Europe around these security issues and sort of NATO pushing more military hardware on a European populace who didn't want to be. If there's cruise missiles in the Netherlands, then theoretically you're a target if you're in the Netherlands, if you're a civilian there, right?
Absolutely.
So, NATO was trying to push this on them. So I think that context of that being precisely the time frame that the Brabant massacres take place, I think is pretty crucial.
Yeah, like I said, these were like an insanely traumatic experience for the country. It was just like absolute terror. There were these attacks were on grocery stores, in taxis, restaurants. There was like a textile factory and a jewelry shop. Like they were all just like small local businesses. And in each of the cases, the attacks, there was basically like a really small amount of money that was taken.
Yeah. Or just like beer.
Yeah, it would be like something like totally like insignificant, but maximum brutality and extremely professional killings took place. I mean, like point blank shootings of entire families, like which was clearly purposeful. It was really it's hard to pull apart the clear like spectacle that was clearly meant to be a huge spectacle in order to strike maximum amount of fear.
Liz,
Right.
have you seen Heat?
Yes.
When he's like blasting in Heat
Yeah.
and he shoots that girl? It reminds me of that. I'm like, these guys were living heat every day, except they shot cops too. But you're right. Like these guys, I mean, the Brabant massacres are some of the most insane instances of this stuff because these guys basically performed this like insane hyper violence and then would just steal like some bottles of wine and stuff like that. Like they bust into a grocery store, cut out the fucking phones and then just like shoot half the people in there and then leave with essentially nothing. They love robbing grocery stores, which is like, I'm sorry, I'm not, not a robber, so maybe I can't speak to lived experience of this, but seems like not like that much money there,
Well, a couple of the instances too, like the money that was stolen was found in like unopened bags, like dumped in a canal. or in a trash. Like there was
Oh,
no.
just throwing it away afterwards.
Yeah, because that first of all, that's not how they get paid,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and second of all, they didn't give a shit. Like it's hard to overstate how horrifying these attacks were. I mean, one of the biggest ones was on St. Martin's Day in Belgium, which is like, by the way, that's like a huge Xmas holiday,
Mhm.
Christmas holiday.
Oh, that's cute.
I know. But basically it's like, there's the night before, like children go to bed and they're supposed to be like presents in the morning. And so that day is like a kind of crazy last minute shopping day for families. This is like, there's a reason why they picked that day, right?
Mhm.
So in this case, a Volkswagen GTI, it was parked outside the supermarket. 3 men with hoods, all holding guns, jump out of the car. The tallest of the 3 produces like a pump action shotgun and just opens fire and point blank kills 2 shoppers instantly.
So this guy's called the Giant too,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
really something.
He then approaches the checkout counter and starts firing randomly at like anything and everything that moves. I think 8 people were killed and 7 were injured, but there was a husband, a wife, and a 14-year-old daughter that were all killed together. There was another father and daughter that were killed as they were trying to run out of the supermarket. And yeah, like we said, they took a couple £1,000, but they later found it unopened, totally abandoned in a ditch. And of course, afterward, the Belgian Justice Minister, Jean Gall, goes on TV and he's like, we need to beef up Belgian national security. There were now police outside every single supermarket. There were paratroopers, like all in the cities. And, at each of these, they, like I mentioned, there were like 16 total attacks that went on for about a year and a half. Each one of those, they targeted the elderly, women, children,
Mhm.
entire families. The object of each of these attacks was how do we maximize like all possible terror among the population? I mean, it's like it's so fucking horrible. It's so fucking horrifying. And this was all part of the Gladio structure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these guys were connected to, Belgium at this point in time. They were, the SDRA 8 in particular was developing this covert. They were basically shooting clubs and associated publications that were associated with those shooting clubs. And not the stereotype, but the type of people who are often attracted to shooting clubs are often right wing in this context. And it became a way to organize these people into a paramilitary. And for instance, this one group in particular, this Westland New Post group.
Yeah.
They found huge troves of NATO documents that were confidential. How did this person get a hold of these things? This is not this person's not a military officer. How is this possible? And one of the people even testified and said, if I stole any of these, I was doing so under the direct order of the SDRA 8. That's who told me to do this. So it starts to become clear that these organizations were definitely a part of this Gladio structure and had a particular flavor to them that arose arising out of the milieu of Belgian fascists at that point, but very, very similar to the kinds of organizations that existed in Italy at the same time.
Yeah, you mentioned the WMP, and we should say that Paul Latinus, who's the commander of the WMP, pretty, I would say infamous Belgian fascist.
Yeah.
He, according to statements that he himself has made, was paid by the Pentagon, specifically DIA, and trained by NATO forces. And he started working with like fascist paramilitaries during the 70s. And, if you know anything about the FP, he was a part of the FP, then set up the WMP at the same time, he was also working within the Belgian government as a like advisor to the labor minister. There was a left-wing journal in the 80s that like tried to expose him as this kind of like secret fascist leader. And at that point he fled to Chile to safety under Pinochet, but returned just 2 months later.
Fleeing to Chile.
Yeah, totally. But returned to Belgium, Belgium 2 months later, right before the Brabant massacres kind of began.
Yeah, which I think is pretty indicative of the role that these groups played in that.
Yeah.
And it was pretty. I mean, if you go, we've talked about like if you go back and look at a lot of the contemporary reporting, I can only look at it through like Google Translate and stuff, but I mean, they were pretty. I mean, particularly when the Gladio stuff started to come out in 1990, when Andreotti revealed a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Belgian journalists were looking back and saying, "Huh,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
lines up." And I think that some of the connections that they had started to make between because at that point it was not understood, when these were happening, that there was this Gladio architecture. But when because you can, okay, sure, yeah, crazy fascist right wingers, sure, they'll form a shooting club, but how can they operate for so long without being caught? That was a huge unanswered question. And so, but then when you find out, oh, there's this bureaucratic structure within which these groups are ensconced in the security apparatus in the Belgian state, that's how they got away with it. They had protection, and many of the members of the Westland New Post explicitly said that we were protected by various elements of the Belgian state, so that we could do what we when we were going off and doing our missions, we had cover. That's what they said. So I think. And so much of that is just has been lost, and nobody's really gone back and followed up on it. Still to this day, there's very limited information in English, especially about Gladio.
There was a Belgian parliamentary investigation into the massacres, like just before some of the secret army revelations were coming out. And this is a quote from that. According to the report, the killers were former members of the security forces, extreme right-wingers who enjoyed high-level protection and were preparing a right-wing coup. And the Guardian did some reporting at the time as well. This is from 1990. Right-wing organizations across Western Europe were being mobilized into the battle as part of an anti-communist strategy originating not with organizations deviant from the institutions of power, but from the state itself, and specifically within the ambit of the state's relations to the Atlantic Alliance, which is pretty explicit in what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
What's weird, again, just to like reiterate this and drive this home, is that 1983, the Soviets are not invading,
No.
right? The fucking Soviet Union is not
It
doing
sucks.
well. And there is no danger of any kind of like mass I mean, there isn't even like big like strong communist parties in Western Europe in the 80s, right? Like the closest thing that you could say is that, again, like what you said with NATO countries, NATO member countries, they're the populations democratically being like, wait a second, we don't want cruise missiles.
Yeah.
That's literally the closest thing you could say that would be threatening any kind of Atlantic alliance in Europe. That's it. And what was deemed appropriate for that was one of the largest sprees of right-wing terror on civilian populations in fucking Western European history.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out too, like, sort of the strategy of tension, one of the purposes of it, or I would say the main purpose of it, is to make people pick a side and flock to the state.
Yeah.
To have to choose between lawlessness and anarchy and a strong state. And in the case of, the places where this was the strategy was employed in Italy and Belgium, the state means, to be supporter of NATO and to be a supporter of the free market in the West over the at this point, admittedly, pretty alien East. These you sort of almost feel sorry for these bums in a way, because they're these neo-fascists, or just fascists, psychopaths and killers, and really what they're being used is like in the employ of liberal internationalism, and the free market. I'm the WNP, I'm not super familiar with what their actual beliefs were, but I am pretty familiar with some sort of adjacent and connected groups that come out of Belgium, like Young Europe or Jeune Europe or whatever, Jean 3R, who is, by the way, one of the most fascinating figures in history to me, just a total fucking freak.
these people were like real deal Nazis, and they're like basically killing people for blue jeans
Yeah.
and Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
pathetic.
The degree to which the European working class at this point had been pretty thoroughly pacified, all of the teeth had been taken out of the socialist
Yeah.
parties. Even the communist parties that still existed had embraced Eurocommunism at this point. It was just it was basically a world historic defeat for the European working class by this point. And like you said, the liberal internationalist order had was very close to its ultimate victory at that point in the mid 1980s. And yet, just under the surface of this, social democratic compromise was this insane violence that the state was more than willing to unleash on its own population in service of this political and economic order. And it's like you said, it's a little pathetic that these Nazis couldn't even they couldn't even fight for their own political vision. Ultimately, they were just in service of, as you said, importing American blue jeans.
Yeah, I mean, for Christ's sake, at least, the Taliban won eventually in Afghanistan.
Right.
These guys can't even say that. There's Liz and I were talking about this group a couple of weeks ago, but if you want to see what these fucking freaks got up to after the Cold War ended, the Order of the Solar Temple is a WNP connected group that was basically a freak cult that ended up killing themselves in Switzerland and murdering each other in a sort of very white Jim Jones style group of assassination suicides. Liz, what happened to Paul Latness?
He killed himself. Funny enough, yeah. He killed himself in I think early 1984. So
I gotta say, a lot of suicides in all this stuff.
Yeah.
People kill themselves. If you're in a Gladio group, you have depression.
In more ways than one, yeah.
They need to go to therapy.
So, I hope, ladies and gentlemen, we've laid out here basically the case that NATO, their first, let's say, full group operation was not the invasion of Afghanistan, but was in fact the infiltration and infiltration is not the word. I don't know, the annihilation of thousands of human beings in Europe for the purposes of spreading anti-neutralism and the free market and anti-Soviet ideas.
Just to comment on the idea that NATO is a defensive alliance, you see this idea bandied about. I think over the past two episodes, I think that we've made the case that it was oriented towards a very particular American form of political economy and enforcing that on the European population in this post-war context. And that meant using these far right-wing fascist elements, many of whom had been explicitly fascist during the war or who followed on that ideology, using them for the purposes of subverting the democracies in Europe and preventing any kind of workers' movement from posing a threat to the imposition of this new capitalist order on the continent.
And even, to say it even more explicitly, that this kind of American hegemony in Western Europe required ultra-violence from fascist paramilitaries.
Yeah.
That's it. And that came in the form of an organization called NATO.
And I think just to sort of bring this into the present day too, regardless of how you feel about the conflict in Ukraine, if you think that these sort of organizations aren't being set up over there too, probably with people who have extreme political beliefs and who are being supplied with heavy weaponry, because if the Russians do eventually take it over, there will be, I think, a great deal of violence from these groups, from stay-behind organizations, and I think we'll see that. A lot of people said that that's what ISIS-K was going to be in Afghanistan. I feel like they fell off pretty quick. No one's really talking about ISIS-K. I'm not gonna look at the Google Trends right now, but I'm willing to bet that ISIS-K spiked for 2 days after the withdrawal and then dropped off precipitously. But this is a military tactic, and it's employed basically everywhere, and it'll continue to be employed today. They should call it Operation Sadio because it's so depressing.
Oh,
Think about that.
that was sweet.
I wanted to interrupt you so bad when you're talking about SDRA 8, the gay SDRA 8 alliance. That work? That don't work? Young Chomsky likes it. You don't seem to like it.
He would.
We're keeping it in.
We have more NATO episodes coming up. We have to now talk about what happens after, unfortunately, the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And when NATO takes an explicit offensive stance, even though, like we've tried to lay out in these two episodes, and I think quite successfully, it has never not taken an offensive stance.
You think, something just occurred to me. I think the Partnership for Peace still exists. I wonder what those guys are like doing right now.
No idea.
I guess this didn't work out. Like, I guess we're not doing this thing with Russia. I don't know, because I think it may not still exist. I got to look it up, but if it does, I'm like, you got to really feel like a chump being at the Partnership for Peace office right now. Let's Liz, get in the Chinook helicopter, the double rotored. Oh, look at that! It's a man it's a dashing aviator in a leather helmet. Oh my God, it's young Chomsky who produced this episode. Why am I doing it like this?
I don't know, but keep going.
I'm on the side of the helicopter now, and I'm going, I love you, Europe. My name is Brace. We're going back to England, which isn't part of you anymore. Who am I with?
Liz.
And young Chomsky over the sound of the rotors here. Our podcast is called TrueAnon.
And
I love
we
you.
will, oh my God. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Let's go shoot Jeffrey Epstein.